When fatal syndromes emerge from incest, the consequences transcend generations and devastate entire families. This was nowhere more evident than in the isolated mountains of eastern Kentucky, where the Harland family's history lay buried for decades until its eventual exposure in 1967. The Appalachian Hills, with their deep valleys and dense forests, provided a perfect refuge for communities wishing to remain separate from the wider society. On these steep slopes, roughly 50 kilometers from the nearest city, lived the Harland family, a lineage dating back to the region's first European settlers in the 18th century. Dr. Robert Caldwell, a rural physician serving Kentucky's most remote communities, was the first to document the case. In his own words, recorded in his medical journal, he wrote, "In my 35 years of medicine, I have never witnessed such a concentration of congenital anomalies within a single family. The Harlands appeared to carry the weight of generations of consanguineous unions. Accessible only by a narrow dirt road that served the mountain, the Harland property saw few visitors, and the family consistently avoided outside contact." When Dr. Caldwell first arrived at the property, responding to an urgent call about a child with breathing difficulties, he was unprepared for what he would discover. The main house was a worn, two-story wooden structure, surrounded by smaller huts scattered across the land. In total, 32 people lived within that family complex. The patriarch, Jacob Harland, was 68 years old in 1967 and wore a permanently severe expression. His wife Margaret was also his first cousin, but it was the third generation that revealed the true impact of consanguinity. Of Jacob and Margaret's 9 children, 7 had married their cousins. From these unions, 23 children were born, 17 of whom had serious developmental problems. Dr. Caldwell immediately noted the distinctive characteristics: prominent jaws, eyes set very close together, fused fingers, and, in several cases, severe intellectual deficiency. The most severe case was that of Timothy, a 12-year-old boy with Apert syndrome, a rare condition characterized by craniofacial malformations and fused fingertips. Timothy was the son of 2 first cousins, Samuel and Ruth Harland. The boy struggled to breathe and suffered constant pain from pressure on his brain, caused by the premature fusion of his skull bones. The family's geographical isolation was just the beginning. Over the passing generations, their social isolation had become absolute. Jacob Harland ruled his family with an iron fist, discouraging any contact with the outside world. The children did not attend school. Modern medicine was viewed with distrust, and marriages were arranged within the family circle. "We preserve our lineage," Jacob told Dr. Caldwell on his first visit. "Pure blood, without contamination from the outside world." The doctor quickly realized he was facing an unprecedented case of genetic isolation. Meticulously, he began documenting each family member, their kinship relationships, and medical conditions, creating what would become one of the most important case studies on the effects of consanguinity in American medical history. However, what began as a medical case soon evolved into a broader investigation. Local authorities, alerted by Dr. Caldwell's preliminary report, began to question if the children were being deprived of appropriate medical care and mandatory education. In June 1967, social workers visited the property, accompanied by the local sheriff. What they found was described as medieval conditions. Children with more severe disabilities were kept in separate rooms, some tied to beds to prevent them from injuring themselves. Medical records were non-existent, and several children had never been officially registered. The case quickly captured the attention of the local press. The Louisville Courier-Journal published a cover story titled "The Forgotton Family of the Mountains," detailing the precarious conditions and genetic anomalies found among the Harlands. Check it out if you are already subscribed to this channel so as not to lose any of the most impactful cases of genetic isolation ever documented in American history. Your subscription helps us continue to investigate these hidden stories that shaped entire communities and warn about the real dangers of consanguinity. The Harland history did not begin in 1967. To fully understand how a family reached such a degree of genetic isolation, we must return to the late 18th century when the first Harlands arrived in the Kentucky mountains. Ezekiel Harland, a Scottish immigrant, settled in the region around 1795, seeking to escape what he called the corruption of eastern cities. He bought 200 acres of mountainous land, built a log cabin, and began raising his family away from the eyes of an expanding society. Historical county records show that Ezekiel married his high school cousin, Hannah, establishing a cultural pattern that was not uncommon at the time, especially among isolated communities. In the rural, isolated communities of the 18th and early 19th centuries, marriage between cousins was not only accepted but often encouraged as a way to keep properties within families. Local historian Martin Thornbury, who extensively studied the isolated communities of the Appalachians, explains, these first colonizing families faced a reality very different from our own. Geographic isolation meant a limited pool of potential marriage partners, and economic considerations often prevailed that are completely unknown to us today. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, deepened the Harlands' isolation further. While Kentucky officially remained in the Union, the region was deeply divided. The Harlands, with their distrust of government authority, withdrew even deeper into the mountains during this turbulent period. It was during this time that the diaries of Josiah Harland, Ezekiel's great-grandson, offer a rare view into the family mindset. In an entry dated 1863, he wrote, "The world outside is shattering in war and madness. Here in the mountains, we preserve our way of life, our lineage, our traditions. We are the last guardians of the true American spirit." This rhetoric of purity and preservation became central to the Harland identity. With each generation, the isolation became not just geographical, but ideological. Children were taught from an early age that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous, and that the family's survival depended on their union, literally. The 1880 census records show 18 Harlands living on the original property, now expanded to 320 acres. Of these, 15 bore the Harland surname, suggesting marriages within the family were already commonplace. The census also notes that 3 children were listed as disabled, though without specifying the nature of their conditions. The turn of the century brought dramatic changes to rural America, but impacted the Harlands very little. While roads, telephones, and eventually electricity reached increasingly remote communities, the family deliberately remained on the sidelines of these advances. A 1948 report from the Kentucky Electric Company mentions that the Harlands refused the installation of power lines on their property, preferring to continue with kerosene lamps. This technological isolation reinforced their social isolation. Without radios or newspapers, the family remained disconnected from world events, the Great Depression, the 2 World Wars. These transformative historical events barely touched the closed universe of the Harlands. It was during the 1930s that Jacob Harland, the patriarch Dr. Caldwell would encounter decades later, took the family's lead. Under his direction, the rules of marriage within the family became even more rigid. Local church documents show he formally withdrew his family from the Baptist congregation in 1935 after a sermon where the local pastor spoke against marriages among close relatives. Jacob developed his own religious interpretation based on selective readings of the Bible and family traditions. This homemade religion emphasized lineage purity and cast the Harlands as a chosen people destined to preserve values the rest of the world had abandoned. The family's isolation was so complete that during the polio vaccination campaigns of the 1950s, health officials were unaware of many Harland children's existence. Only years later, when records were examined after the 1967 intervention, was it discovered that at least 2 children in the family had died of polio, a disease easily preventable by the Salk vaccine available since 1955. As we move into the 1960s, we can see how generations of isolation created the perfect conditions for a dangerous genetic concentration. The isolation was no longer just a cultural or geographical choice, it had been inscribed into the Harland family's very DNA. When Dr. Robert Caldwell began systematically documenting the medical conditions of the Harland family members in 1967, he was unknowingly contributing to an emerging field of medicine, population genetics. His meticulous records, preserved today at the University of Kentucky, offer one of the most complete case studies on the biological effects of prolonged consanguinity. What we observed in the Harland family is not simply an isolated case of cousin marriage, but the cumulative result of generations of consanguinity, explained Dr. Elena Simmons, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University who studied the case in the 1970s. It is like watching centuries of compressed genetic evolution in just a few generations. To understand what happened to the Harlands, we must examine the foundations of genetics. Each person carries 2 copies of each gene, one inherited from the mother and one from the father. Many defective genes are recessive. Their effects only manifest when a person inherits 2 copies of the defective gene, one from each parent. In genetically diverse populations, the probability of 2 partners carrying the same defective recessive gene is relatively low. But when close relatives have children, this probability increases dramatically, as they share a significant percentage of their genetic material. First-degree cousins share approximately 12.5% of their genes. When they marry, the probability of their children inheriting 2 copies of the same defective recessive gene is far greater than in the general population. When this pattern repeats for generations, as with the Harlands, the result is an increasing concentration of deleterious recessive genes. Among the Harland children, Dr. Caldwell documented an impressive array of rare genetic conditions. Beyond Timothy's Apert syndrome, there were cases of polydactyly, extra fingers or toes, in 6 children, syndactyly, fused fingers, in 4 children, retinitis pigmentosa, a degenerative retinal disease leading to blindness, in 3 teenagers, and cleft palates in 5 children, with varying degrees of intellectual disability in 14 children. Particularly remarkable was the case of identical twins James and John Harland, born in 1955. Both had a rare form of disproportionate dwarfism known as spondylar epiphyseal dysplasia. This condition, characterized by a short trunk and limbs and spinal problems, is caused by mutations in the COL2A1 gene, which encodes type II collagen, an essential protein for bone and cartilage development. These twins represent one of the clearest cases of recessive genetic expression I have observed, Dr. Caldwell noted in his records. Their condition is so rare that the likelihood of it occurring by chance in a non-consanguineous population would be practically nil. The impact of consanguinity was not limited to visible physical conditions. Subsequent studies of the Harland medical records revealed an abnormally high incidence of congenital heart disease, kidney problems, and rare metabolic disorders. The operation to the Harland children, many of whom had never interacted with people outside the family, faced enormous adaptation challenges. Mary Harland, a social worker assigned to the case, unrelated to the family, documented her observations. The Harland children show extreme levels of separation anxiety and difficulty adapting to new environments. Many exhibit significant social development delays, with communication patterns and interactions that reflect their prolonged isolation. Particularly moving was the case of siblings Sarah and Michael Harland, aged 8 and 10. Both had moderate intellectual disabilities and had never been separated before. Placed in different adoptive homes due to their specific medical needs, they developed severe regressive behaviors requiring intensive psychological intervention. For some of the older children, integration into the outside world brought a mixture of trauma and liberation. Elizabeth Harland, then 16, wrote in a diary later included in the case records, "Everything is frightening and strange. The lights are too bright. People talk too fast. But for the first time, I am learning things Jacob would never have allowed us to know. Yesterday, a nurse explained to me why so many babies in our family are born sick or die. It is not God's punishment. If you watched so far, it is because you like this story. Leave a comment saying I watched here so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel." Nearly 6 decades after the Harland family's discovery, their case continues to influence medicine, law, and social ethics. The legacy of this family, isolated in the Kentucky mountains, extends far beyond their individual circumstances, offering valuable lessons for contemporary society. Of Jacob Harland's 23 children and grandchildren living on the property in 1967, we can now trace remarkably diverse life trajectories. Timothy, the boy with Apert syndrome whose condition first drew Dr. Caldwell's attention, underwent surgery and received continuous treatment. Though he never fully overcame his physical and cognitive limitations, he lived to be 47, far beyond what would have been possible without medical intervention. He died in 2002 due to cardiac complications related to his condition. The twins, James and John Harland, with their disproportionate dwarfism, followed surprisingly different paths. John, adopted by a resourceful family in Louisville, received adapted education and eventually graduated high school. He worked as an accountant for many years and became an advocate for the rights of people with disabilities. James, who remained closer to the original community, had less access to treatments and educational opportunities, illustrating how environment can profoundly influence development even when genetics impose significant challenges. Sarah Harland, one of the younger children at the time of the intervention, perhaps represents the most inspiring story. Adopted by a family of university professors, she overcame her initial developmental delays and eventually graduated with a degree in social work. In a remarkable turnaround, Sarah dedicated her professional career to working with isolated communities in Appalachia, helping to bring education on reproductive and genetic health to populations that, like her biological family, remained on the fringes of modern society. "I carry the Harlands not only in my DNA, but in my life's mission," Sarah stated in a rare 2005 interview for a documentary about the case. "Every community I help connect with medical and educational resources represents a family like mine that can be spared unnecessary suffering." From a medical perspective, the Harland case generated significant advances in understanding recessive genetic diseases. The extensive genetic mapping of the family, which began in the 1970s and continued with more advanced technologies in the following decades, helped researchers identify specific genes associated with various rare conditions. Dr. Jennifer Lowe, a geneticist at the University of Kentucky Center, explains, "The meticulous records kept on the Harland family have allowed us to track the inheritance of specific genetic mutations through multiple generations. This type of longitudinal study is extremely rare and valuable, offering insights that simply could not be obtained any other way." In 1989, researchers using preserved family DNA samples identified a specific mutation in the FGFR2 gene responsible for Timothy's Apert syndrome. This discovery later contributed to better prenatal diagnostic methods and early interventions for children born with this condition. In the legal field, the Harland versus Kentucky state case established important precedents regarding the limits of family autonomy when it conflicts with child welfare. Cited in more than 40 subsequent cases involving isolated religious communities, Judge Harrison's decision continues to influence the legal balance between religious freedom and child protection. The original Harland property, the subject of legal disputes for many years, was eventually divided among several heirs. The main house, where Jacob Harland once ruled his small, isolated kingdom, was abandoned in the 1980s and destroyed by a fire in 1992. Today, only the stone foundations remain, gradually being reclaimed by the surrounding forest, a physical reminder of a way of life that lasted nearly 2 centuries, now vanished. The ethical implications of the Harland case remain relevant in the 21st century. With the advent of advanced genetic technologies and consumer DNA tests, issues of genetic counseling, privacy, and reproductive autonomy have gained new urgency. The Harland case reminds us that scientific knowledge must be democratized, argues Dr. Michael Sanderson, a bioethicist at the University of Chicago. When vital information on genetic health remains concentrated only among the privileged and educated, we perpetuate a system where some communities remain vulnerable to harmful patterns that could be avoided. Perhaps the most moving aspect of the Harland legacy is how it illuminates the tension between tradition and progress, between cultural preservation and individual well-being. In isolated communities that still exist around the world, from closed religious groups to geographically remote populations, the balance between respecting traditions and protecting against potentially harmful practices remains a challenge. The Harland story is not simply about the biological dangers of consanguinity, but about how isolation, geographical, educational, and ideological, can create cycles of suffering that transcend generations. At the same time, it is a story of human resilience and the capacity to adapt, even after generations of isolation. In 2015, the University of Kentucky inaugurated the Harland Center for Population Genetic Studies, dedicated to researching rare genetic diseases and developing extension programs for isolated rural communities. Partially funded by an anonymous donation, believed to be from one of the family's descendants, it aims to transform a legacy of suffering into a resource for prevention and education. Check it out if you are already subscribed to this channel so as not to lose any of the most impactful cases that reveal the hidden consequences of social and genetic isolation. Each subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories that educate and warn about the real dangers that can hide in isolated communities. Don't forget to leave your like and share this video with anyone you think would be interested in this impressive story of American medicine. The Harland case remains a powerful reminder that scientific knowledge, when accessible to all, has the power to liberate entire communities from cycles of avoidable suffering. In Sarah Harland's words, "My family's true tragedy was not the genes we shared, but the information we never had access to. That knowledge would have been our salvation." Today, as we look back on the Harland history, we see not only a family tragedy but a microcosm reflecting broader questions about how societies handle the balance between tradition and scientific progress. In a world where isolated communities still exist, where ancient beliefs sometimes clash with modern knowledge, the Harland legacy reminds us of our collective responsibility to ensure that life-saving knowledge is available to everyone, no matter how far they may be from centers of power and education. The story ends, but its lessons remain alive, echoing through generations as a call for compassion, understanding, and the democratization of knowledge that has the power to break cycles of silent suffering.